The 2022 invasion of Ukraine was supposed to be what Russians call a small victorious war.
Ukraine's military says it's facing a growing problem of desertion. Experts estimate approximately 150,000 service members may be missing from their units as the war grinds through its fifth year.
Something just cracked inside Russia that Putin cannot fix. It did not happen on the battlefield. It did not happen in a back room where oligarchs whisper about succession. It happened in Russia's own parliament, in front of cameras, with the whole country watching. The leader of Russia's Communist Party walked to the parliamentary rostrum and said the words that every Kremlin official has been forbidden to speak out loud. The first quarter was a complete disaster. And then he looked across the chamber and delivered a warning that stopped the room cold. If urgent measures are not taken, Russia will face in the fall what happened in 1917. Not a metaphor, not political theater. A direct comparison between Vladimir Putin's Russia today and Tsarist Russia in the final months before the revolution that ended the Romanov dynasty, triggered a civil war, and rewrote the map of the world. This was spoken inside the parliament of a country where saying the wrong thing about the war sends people to prison for years. And Putin could not stop it, could not suppress it, could not even respond to it. Because the man who said it was not wrong, and everyone in that chamber knew it. To understand why this warning landed like a detonation, you need to understand what actually destroyed Tsarist Russia in 1917, because it was not a foreign army. It was not a superior military power crossing Russia's borders. It was three pressures converging simultaneously from inside pressures that the regime refused to acknowledge until the moment they became fatal. The first was military catastrophe. Russia's armies were suffering losses that destroyed families across the country. The promised victories never came. The soldiers kept dying. And the gap between what state propaganda announced and what families received in telegrams from the front became a wound that would not close. The second was economic collapse. The war had consumed Russia's financial reserves. Inflation was destroying the purchasing power of ordinary people. Food was becoming expensive and scarce. The social contract between the state and the population we sacrifice, you deliver, had been broken so many times that nobody believed it could be repaired. The third was the collapse of legitimacy. When the bread riots began, the security forces the Tsar depended on to maintain order refused to fire on the crowds. The soldiers looked at the protesters and saw their own mothers, their own wives, their own children, and they put down their weapons. A dynasty that had ruled for centuries was gone in weeks. Now look at Russia today, and try to find a single structural difference. The answer is there is none, and that reality is what made the chamber go silent when Zyuganov finished speaking, because every person in that room understood the comparison was not rhetorical. It was a clinical diagnosis delivered by someone who has studied Russian political collapse his entire life. Think about what it takes to stand in Russia's parliament in 2026 and invoke 1917. This is not a free country where opposition figures routinely criticize the government without consequence. This is a country where journalists go to prison for calling the war a war, where ordinary citizens have been sentenced to years of hard labor for holding blank pieces of paper in a public square, where the word defeat cannot be spoken on national television. Zyuganov did not make that comparison accidentally. He made it because he believes the situation has deteriorated, to the point where saying it out loud is less dangerous than staying silent while the collapse accelerates around him. Russia is losing 35,000 soldiers per month in Ukraine. 96% of those casualties are caused by Ukrainian drones. The spring offensive that Putin promised would break Ukraine has produced net zero territorial gain. Russian forces are now advancing on Chinese-made motorcycles because drone strikes have destroyed their armor faster than Russian factories can replace it. The promised victories have not come. The soldiers keep dying. And the families know it, even when state television does not say it. Russia's federal budget ran a $61 billion deficit in the first 3 months of this year alone. Oil revenues, the financial foundation of everything Putin built, collapsed by 45% in a single quarter because Ukraine's long-range drones destroyed between 20 and 40% of Russia's refinery capacity. Real inflation has surpassed 20%. The value-added tax has been raised to 22%, tightening the grip around ordinary Russian families who are already struggling. Russia froze its own gasoline exports to prevent a domestic fuel crisis. And independent polling from the Levada Center, Russia's most credible research organization, shows that 67% of Russians now want the war to end immediately and peace talks to begin, unconditionally. The faction that wants to fight until Ukraine is fully occupied has collapsed to 24%, the lowest number since the invasion began. The military catastrophe is real, the economic collapse is real, and the legitimacy crisis is real. This is not similar to 1917. It is structurally identical. The economic dimension of what is happening inside Russia deserves to be understood fully, because it is worse than anything the Kremlin's messaging has been able to conceal. Ukraine's long-range drone campaign has done something that no previous military strategy against Russia ever achieved. It has attacked the revenue stream that funds everything else. Putin built his entire political system on energy money. Oil and gas revenues flow into the federal budget, and from there into soldier salaries, weapons procurement, regional government transfers, and the patronage payments that keep Russia's elite class loyal. Remove the oil money and the entire structure begins to shake because there is nothing holding it together underneath. When Ukrainian drones began systematically destroying refinery infrastructure deep inside Russia, processing capacity dropped by 500,000 barrels per day. The direct damage bill reached $13 billion, and the oil revenues that Putin counted on to sustain the war indefinitely dropped by nearly half in a single quarter. The $61 billion deficit that resulted is not an abstraction on a spreadsheet somewhere. It is the difference between what Russia promised to pay and what Russia can actually deliver. Soldier salaries delayed, regional transfers reduced, social programs cut. The patronage payments that purchase elite loyalty become impossible to sustain when the money is not there. Putin was caught on camera scolding his own ministers at an economic meeting in front of rolling cameras. For a leader whose entire political persona was constructed on the image of cold, unshakable control, this visible public display of frustration and desperation is a signal that cuts through every layer of state messaging. The ministers being dressed down in front of cameras understood what they were witnessing, not anger, fear, and here is the part that no one is talking about. The signals are appearing in places the Kremlin cannot control. Regional governors who spent years competing to demonstrate loyalty to Moscow are now quietly diverting federal resources toward local priorities, rather than sending everything up the chain as they once did. The institutional reflex of Russian regional power defer to Moscow, absorb the consequences, stay loyal, is weakening as Moscow's ability to reward loyalty and punish disloyalty simultaneously degrades. In Siberia, in Dagestan, in Russia's far eastern regions, local officials are beginning to voice grievances that would have been unthinkable 2 years ago. The complaint is always the same. Moscow took our resources for decades. Moscow sent our sons to die in a war that has nothing to do with us. And now Moscow has nothing left to offer us in return. That sentiment, spreading from the periphery toward the center, is one of the structural preconditions that historians identify in every major Russian political crisis. Former Kremlin propagandist Ilya Remesov publicly called Putin a war criminal and switched sides. The people whose professional purpose was defending Putin's image are beginning to calculate that the cost of continued loyalty may now exceed the cost of walking away. When the propagandists start leaving, the end is closer than the official numbers suggest. On the front lines, the military reality driving the political crisis has become impossible to deny, even inside Russia's own command structure. Defense Minister Andrei Belousov told Putin privately that Ukraine has technological superiority in drones and that the situation is critical. This assessment was delivered behind closed doors, but it became known, and what it reveals is that Russia's senior military leadership has stopped believing their own public statements. Ukrainian FPV drones are destroying Russian armor at a rate that Russian production cannot replace. Before mechanized columns can reach attack positions, drone strikes convert them into burning wreckage visible for miles. The soldiers advancing on foot behind those destroyed columns have no modern helmets, no adequate body armor, and no protection from the surveillance systems that track their every movement from above. Russia has responded by placing air defense systems around Moscow, around the Kremlin, and around Putin's personal residences. Read that again carefully. The leader of a country with one of the world's largest military arsenals is surrounding his own home with air defense batteries. That is not the behavior of a man who believes he is winning. The Kremlin imposed a digital blackout across central Moscow, severing mobile internet and telegram connections across the capital. They cut the internet in their own city because they were more afraid of Russians talking to each other than they were of any external threat. It backfired. The anger that had been building for months found expression in street protests. A video filmed by Russian blogger Victoria Bona was watched 30 million times before the regime could suppress it. The wall of fear that has kept Russian streets quiet for years has developed cracks that state censorship cannot seal. The Kremlin's response to every sign of domestic instability has followed the same pattern throughout this crisis. Suppress the information, arrest the messenger, issue a stronger statement of confidence, and then suppress the next outbreak when the stronger statement fails to prevent it. That pattern is becoming visibly less effective with every iteration. The digital blackout in Moscow was supposed to prevent protest coordination. Instead, it became proof to every Russian watching that the government was afraid of its own citizens communicating freely. The arrest of prominent voices was supposed to deter others from speaking. Instead, it became evidence that the government had no better answer to dissent than imprisonment. Every suppression measure that fails to stop the next outbreak of anger makes the next outbreak slightly larger, and the regime's response slightly more desperate. Putin is not losing control of Russia because his opponents are strong. He is losing control because the system he built to maintain control is consuming the resources it needs to function. Here is what Russia's internal collapse means for America, and it is the dimension most coverage fails to reach. America did not need to put a single soldier on Russian soil to produce the crisis that is now visible from inside Russia's own parliament. America needed to sustain support for Ukraine long enough for Ukrainian drones to dismantle the economic foundation that Putin built his entire political system on. Every refinery that Ukraine's drones struck inside Russia was a strike against Putin's ability to pay his soldiers, maintain elite loyalty, fund regional governments, and sustain the fiction that the war was going according to plan. What often gets overlooked is this. The 45% collapse in Russian oil revenues did not happen because of sanctions alone. It happened because American-backed Ukrainian military capability reached inside Russia and destroyed the industrial infrastructure that sanctions could not touch. The drone technology that produced that result was developed, scaled, and sustained with American support, allied resources, and the intelligence architecture that America's strategic partnerships make possible. Every American taxpayer who has supported Ukraine's defense should understand what their investment is producing inside Russia right now. A parliament where a senior opposition leader compares the sitting president to the last czar. A defense minister privately acknowledging technological inferiority to Ukraine. A president scolding ministers on camera because the money is running out. A population where 67% want the war to end. This is what American strategic commitment to a determined ally actually produces over time, not just battlefield results. The internal conditions for regime crisis in the country that tried to redraw the map of Europe by force. For the first time in decades, the pressure inside Russia is not coming from outside its borders. It is coming from inside its own economy, its own military, its own parliament, and its own streets. $61 billion deficit in one quarter. 45% collapse in oil revenues, 35,000 casualties every month, 67% of Russians demanding the war end, a parliament leader comparing Putin to the last czar, a president publicly losing composure in front of cameras, a digital blackout in Moscow, street protests watched 30 million times. In 1917, the pressures that ended the Romanov dynasty built for years and detonated in weeks. The regime that thought it was unshakable discovered that the foundations it had built on were not what it believed them to be. Putin has spent 20 years constructing the image of an invincible leader presiding over an invincible state. That image required energy revenues to fund it, military victories to validate it, and a population willing to believe it. Ukraine's drones took the revenues, the casualty lists took the victories, and 67% of Russians have stopped believing. Is Russia crossing the threshold where the pressures Zyuganov described in Parliament become impossible to contain the same way they became impossible to contain in 1917? Or does Putin still have one move left that changes what the whole world just watched happen inside his own parliament? Drop your answer below. I read every single comment. If you want daily coverage that does not sugarcoat what is actually happening, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. I post every single day and I am not stopping.